here. I'm going to be live streaming and broadcasting some of this Boris Johnson news. So anyway, lots of people do this. So I'm going to press play and see what's going on with John Bercow, the Speaker of Parliament, on the TV, because I want to know what's going on. So let's put this on here and just position the camera and see if you guys can see my fingers are there. I'm just trying to position the camera. If it'll just balance, I don't know if it will. Shit. I have this problem every time. There we go. It should stay there, hopefully. Let's begin, guys. One will say to me. And people that are watching.
I welcome the judgment this morning of the Supreme Court.
This is John Bercow, the Speaker of Parliament.
That judgment
UK, London.
Is unanimous. That judgment is unambiguous. And that judgment is unqualified. As you all now know, that judgment is that the prorogation of Parliament was unlawful. Unlawful because it prevented or frustrated Parliament in the discharge of its core duties. And it did so at a crucial time for our country. The citizens of the UK are entitled to expect that Parliament does discharge its core functions, that it is in a position to scrutinise the executive, to hold ministers to account, and to legislate if it chooses. In the light of that explicit judgment, I have instructed authorities to prepare, not for the recall, the prorogation was unlawful and is void, to prepare for the resumption of the business of the House of Commons. Specifically, I've instructed the House authorities to undertake such steps as are necessary to ensure that the House of Commons sits tomorrow and that it does so at 11:30 a.m. I have contacted party leaders and, where that has not been possible, senior representatives of political parties in order to inform them of my thinking and to prepare the way for the House of Commons to do its work. Owing to notification requirements, with which I'm sure you're all closely familiar, it will not be possible for there to be a Prime Minister's questions tomorrow. However, for the avoidance of doubt, there will be full scope for urgent questions, for ministerial statements, and for applications for emergency debates under Standing Order number 24. Colleagues, I thank you for your interest, and I hope you will agree that the position is clear and unmistakable. Good afternoon.
Well, that was John Bercow. Oh, the bloody screen's gone off. Hate it when it does this, guys, when the screen decides to go off. There we go. Go down there and go to Boris Johnson's speech. So let's have a look here. Boris Johnson talk.
We all have the power to shift perception.
And it's a very exciting time in our country. We're getting on with delivering. I just want to say a word or two about that, because there's been a court case in our country this morning, which I think one or two of you may have picked up on the media, and it would be remiss and wrong of me not to address that directly, and we've got
This is Boris
our
Johnson's
friends
speak,
from the UK
guys.
media here as well, and so I just want to say to everybody
Prime Minister of the UK.
back home, for the avoidance of doubt, I have the highest respect, of course, for our judiciary and for the independence of our courts, but I must say I strongly disagree with this judgment, and we in the UK will not be deterred from getting on and delivering on the will of the people to come out of the EU on October the 31st, because that is what we were mandated to do. And we will simultaneously refuse to be deterred from delivering on what I think you would all expect, an exciting, dynamic domestic agenda intended to make our country ever more attractive to live in and to invest in. So we'll be pushing on with infrastructure investment, with 20,000 police, with investing in our NHS. And to do that, we will need a Queen's speech to set out what we are going to do. And I think, frankly, that is what the people of my country, of the UK, want to see. They want to see us getting on with a strong domestic agenda, and believe you me, they want to see Brexit delivered by October the 31st. Anyway, that's what you need to know about what's happened in the court today. But I can tell you that under any circumstances, court judgments, adverse or otherwise, my heart lifts when I come to New York, because there's something amazing about the city. It's got an incredible amount of energy. It's got sort of I love the blue sky against the skyscrapers, the weird, strange Martian water towers on the tops of the buildings. It's the things about New York you never find anywhere else. But there are many ways in which New York and London are not just similar, but actually united. It's not just both cities obviously share a language, kind of. We have a basic idea of freedom, don't we? We have a basic idea of freedom. And the idea is very simple, common to our democracies and our traditions, that if you obey the law and you do no harm to others, then you can come and you can live your life as you please in these great cities without being judged or censured. And I think it's the excitement of that freedom that brings people of talent to New York as it brings people to London. And you say you get this cyclotron effect and the flash of inspiration that leads to innovation, that leads to prosperity and growth. And very often it will be a synthesis between American and British ideas, like this thing outside, which is absolutely fantastic. We invented, for instance, the underground train. You invented the safety brake, or Otis invented the safety brake elevator, and taking them together, you've got the recipe for a modern metropolis. And you can see that same fusion today across our cities in every sphere, from tech to the arts to newspapers. And you know the things, actually, they're going up. I think there are now 1.2 million US people employed by UK companies, a million or more in the UK. Trade now worth 200 billion a year. Have I got that right? Going up the whole time. Colossal investment. But to cut to the chase, we now want to do so much more, because our country is going up a gear. On October the 31st, as I say, we intend to be more global, more outward-looking, more committed to the rest of the world than ever before. And we're going to take advantage of all the freedoms that Brexit can give, whether that's new tax allowances for investment, or speeding up public procurement contracts, or creating new free ports, enterprise zones, devising better regulation for sectors in which the UK leads the world, whether that's bioscience or financial service or whatever, with more competitive tax rates and the best skilled workforce in the hemisphere. So I say to everybody who's done me the honour of coming this morning to this breakfast, we will
I'm drinking a passion punch, as you guys can see here.
We are increasing the number of visas for scientists. We're
Purple,
ensuring
it's
that your
called.
brilliant students can stay on for 2 years, so as to get real value from their studies, and so that our economy in the UK benefits from their expertise. We are even, I'm delighted to see John Hong K here, we're even ensuring that US visitors are able to use the electronic e-passport system at Heathrow. Is that right? Fantastic. That ought to get a mild ripple of applause. I'm sure I use it the whole time. And yes, we want to do the much vaunted free trade. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, because there will be things where we do not want our NHS to be on the table. There will be difficulties. But I'm very glad that President Trump has set up the special relationship economic working group, because it is absolutely absurd that there should be tariffs in the UK on Californian wine, quite heavy tariffs, or British shoppers should pay over the odds for Florida orange juice. But it is also absurd and indefensible that the population of America, to the best of my knowledge, has gone for decades without eating a morsel of British lamb or beef, let alone haggis. And I have discovered that anyone wanting to sell socks to the United States, I've got to be careful with this, but anyway, I think they at least face a tariff. Is that right? This statistic is contested in some ways. They face a tariff of 19%. I was told that there are some fibers that have to be taken to a laboratory and set fire to twice. But the hosiery industry of Britain disputes this. They think they can overcome this barrier. But there are others. There is only certain ports in the United States are licensed for the import of British cauliflowers. Can you believe that? And the US military are banned from buying British tape measures, as though there was some kind of general prejudice still against British rulers of all kinds. So I ask you, is this, my friends, is this really necessary? Let's work together to break down these barriers that have been devised by bureaucrats, because all the evidence of the last 2 centuries, this is the free trade is the best and fastest way to increase the prosperity of both our peoples. This year, our country, the United Kingdom, takes a giant step out into the world, in keeping with our traditions, but also with our new ambitions to build on our friendships and our relationships with our friends in Europe, in the US, and in Canada. We do it with confidence to make Britain the best place in the world to start, to build, and to run a business. The place you will want to be, and the place you will want your business to be. And that's why I say to everyone here, come and join us. Thank you very much for having me this morning. Thank you.
Well, that was very interesting, of Boris Johnson. What else has he said today on the news?
We all have the power to shift perception.
So I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead, and of course Parliament will come back. I do think there's a good case for getting on with a Queen's speech anyway, and we'll do that. But I think the most important thing is we get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st. And there's clearly the claimants in this case are determined to try to frustrate that and to stop that. I think it'd be very unfortunate if Parliament made that objective, which the people want delivered, more difficult. But we'll get on. There are a lot of people who basically want to stop this country coming out of the EU, and we have a Parliament that is unable to lead the roads, unable to doesn't want to have an election, and I think it's time we took things forward. As the law currently stands, the UK leaves the EU on October the 31st, come what may. But the interesting thing, the exciting thing for us now is to get a good deal, and that's what we're working on. And I'll be honest with you, John, it's not made much easier by this kind of stuff in Parliament or in the courts.
You say, as the law stands, we leave on October the 31st. That's not true, is it? As the law stands, we cannot leave with no deal on October 31st without the permission of Parliament.
As the law stands, we leave on October the 31st, and I'm very hopeful that we will get a deal.
The court is back. We have before us 2 appeals, one from the High Court of England and Wales, and one from the Inner House of the Court of Session in Scotland. It is important once again to emphasise that these cases are not about when and on what terms the United Kingdom is to leave the European Union. They are only about whether the advice given by the Prime Minister to Her Majesty the Queen on 27th or 28th of August, that Parliament should be prorogued from a date between 9th and 12th September until 14th October was lawful, and the legal consequences if it was not. The question arises in circumstances which have never risen before and are unlikely to arise again. It is a one-off. Briefly, the Scottish case was brought by a cross-party group of 75 members of Parliament and a QC on the 30th of July because of their concern that Parliament might be prorogued to avoid further debate in the lead-up to Exit Day on the 31st of October. On the 15th of August, Nicky da Costa, Director of Legislative Affairs at Number 10, sent a memorandum to the Prime Minister, copied to 7 people, civil servants and special advisers, recommending that his parliamentary private secretary approach the palace with a request for prorogation to begin within 9th to 12th September and for a Queen's speech on 14th October. The Prime Minister ticked yes to that recommendation. On 27th or 28th August, in a telephone call, he formally advised Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament between those dates. On 28th August, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Leader of the House of Commons and Lord President of the Privy Council, Mr. Mark Harper, Chief Whip, and the Baroness Evans of Bowes Park, Leader of the House of Lords, attended a meeting of the Privy Council held by the Queen at Balmoral Castle. An order in Council was made that Parliament be prorogued between those dates, and that the Lord Chancellor prepare and issue a commission for proroguing Parliament accordingly. A Cabinet meeting was held by conference call shortly after that in order to bring the rest of the Cabinet, quote, up to speed, end quote, on the decisions that had been taken. That same day, the decision was made public, and the Prime Minister sent a letter to all members of Parliament explaining it. As soon as the decision was announced, Mrs. Miller began the English proceedings challenging its lawfulness. Parliament returned from the summer recess on the 3rd of September. The House of Commons voted to decide for themselves what business they would transact. The next day, what became the European Union Withdrawal No. 2 Act passed all its stages in the Commons. It passed all its stages in the House of Lords on the 6th September and received royal assent on the 9th September. The object of that Act is to prevent the United Kingdom leaving the European Union without a withdrawal agreement on the 31st of October. On the 11th of September, the High Court of England and Wales delivered judgment dismissing Mrs. Miller's claim on the ground that the issue was not justiciable in a court of law. That same day, the Inner House of the Court of Session in Scotland announced its decision that the issue was justiciable, that it was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing parliamentary scrutiny of the government, and that it and any prorogation which followed it were unlawful and thus void and of no effect. Mrs. Miller's appeal against the English decision and the Advocate General's appeal against the Scottish decision were heard by this court from 17th to 19th September. Because of the importance of the case, we convened a panel of 11 justices, the maximum number of serving justices who are permitted to sit. This judgment is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. The first question is whether the lawfulness of the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty is justiciable. This court holds that it is. The courts have exercised a supervisory jurisdiction over the lawfulness of acts of the government for centuries. As long ago as 1611, the court held that, quote, the king, who was then the government, hath no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him, end quote. However, in considering prerogative powers, it is necessary to distinguish between two different questions. The first is whether a prerogative power exists, and if so, its extent. The second is whether the exercise of that power within its limits is open to legal challenge. This second question may depend upon what the power is all about. Some powers are not amenable to judicial review, while others are. However, there is no doubt that the courts have jurisdiction to decide upon the extent and limits of a prerogative power. All the parties to this case accept that. This court has concluded that this case is about the limits of the power to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament. The second question, therefore, is what are the limits to that power? Two fundamental principles of our Constitution are relevant to deciding that question. The first is parliamentary sovereignty, that Parliament can make laws which everyone must obey. This will be undermined if the executive could, through the use of prerogative, prevent Parliament from exercising its powers to make law for as long as it, the executive, pleased. The second fundamental principle is parliamentary accountability. In the words of Jerningam, senior law lord, quote, "The conduct of government by a Prime Minister and Cabinet, collectively responsible and accountable to Parliament, lies at the heart of Westminster democracy." End quote. The power to prorogue is limited by the constitutional principles with which it would otherwise conflict. For present purposes, the relevant limit on the power to prorogue is this: that a decision to prorogue or advise the monarch to prorogue will be unlawful if the prorogation has the effect of frustrating or preventing, without reasonable justification, the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions as a legislature and as the body responsible for the supervision of the executive. In judging any justification which might be put forward, the court must, of course, be sensitive to the responsibilities and experience of the Prime Minister and proceed with appropriate caution. If the prorogation does have that effect, without reasonable justification, there is no need for the court to consider whether the Prime Minister's motive or purpose was unlawful. The third question, therefore, is whether this prorogation did have the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. This was not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech. It prevented Parliament from carrying out its constitutional role for 5 out of the possible 8 weeks between the end of the summer recess and exit day on the 31st of October. Proroguing Parliament is quite different from Parliament going into recess. While Parliament is prorogued, neither House can meet, debate, or pass legislation. Neither House can debate government policy, nor may members ask written or oral questions of ministers or meet and take evidence in committees. In general, bills that have not yet completed all their stages are lost and will have to start again from scratch after the Queen's speech. During a recess, on the other hand, the House does not sit, but parliamentary business can otherwise continue as usual. This prolonged suspension of parliamentary democracy took place in quite exceptional circumstances. The fundamental change which was due to take place in the Constitution of the United Kingdom on the 31st of October. Parliament, and in particular the House of Commons, as the elected representatives of the people, has a right to a voice in how that change comes about. The effect on the fundamentals of our democracy was extreme. No justification for taking action with such an extreme effect has been put before the court. The only evidence of why it was taken is the memorandum from Nicky da Costa of 15th August. This explains why holding the Queen's speech to open a new session of Parliament on the 14th of October would be desirable. It does not explain why it was necessary to bring parliamentary business to a halt for 5 weeks before that, when the normal period necessary to prepare for a Queen's speech is 4 to 6 days. It does not discuss the difference between prorogation and recess. It does not discuss the impact of prorogation on the special procedures for scrutinising the delegated legislation necessary to achieve an orderly withdrawal from the European Union, with or without a withdrawal agreement, on the 31st of October. It does not discuss what parliamentary time would be needed to secure approval for any new withdrawal agreement as required by Section 13 of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The Court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful, because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. The next and final question, therefore, is what the legal effect of that finding is, and therefore what remedies the Court should grant. The Court can certainly declare that the advice was unlawful. The Inner House went further and declared that any prorogation resulting from it was null and of no effect. The government argues that the Inner House could not do that because the prorogation was a, quote, proceeding in Parliament, end quote, which, under the Bill of Rights of 1688, cannot be impugned or questioned in any court. But it is quite clear that the prorogation is not a proceeding in Parliament. It takes place in the House of Lords chamber, in the presence of members of both houses, but it is not their decision. It is something which has been imposed upon them from outside. It is not something on which members can speak or vote. It is not the core or essential business of Parliament which the Bill of Rights protects. Quite the reverse. It brings that core or essential business to an end. This Court has already concluded that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void, and of no effect. This means that the order in Council to which it led was also unlawful, void, and of no effect, and should be quashed. This means that when the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper. The prorogation was also void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued. This is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. It is for Parliament, and in particular the Speaker and the Lord Speaker, to decide what to do next. Unless there is some parliamentary rule of which we are unaware, they can take immediate steps to enable each House to meet as soon as possible. It is not clear to us that any step is needed from the Prime Minister, but if it is, the Court is pleased that his Council have told the Court that he will take all necessary steps to comply with the terms of any declaration made by this Court. It follows that the Advocate General's appeal in the case of Cherry is dismissed and Mrs. Miller's appeal is allowed. The same declarations and orders should be made in each case. Copies of our full judgment explaining these conclusions and a transcript of this summary will be available immediately after the Court rises, and I urge you all to read them with care. The Court will now adjourn.
Today, your information is more exposed than ever.
Britain's Supreme Court has delivered a devastating defeat to Boris Johnson. In a unanimous ruling, 11 judges have ruled that his decision to suspend Parliament, which was deliberating on Brexit, was unlawful. Here with me is Matthew Garahan, the news editor, to discuss this frankly epic moment in the history of Britain as a constitution.
It was big. How the language, the harshness of the language in this ruling was quite unprecedented, wasn't it?
Well, Britain's Supreme Court is 10 years old. It's not like the US Supreme Court that goes back to 1787. But in a way, this was as big as a very important judgment back in 1801 called Marbury versus Madison, where essentially the US Supreme Court ruled against the executive and set out the parameters of power for the executive and the legislature and the courts. And this was this moment, even though we have an unwritten constitution in the UK.
What do you think the immediate repercussions of it will be?
Well, for Mr. Johnson, given the language, which was, again, ruthless, it argued, contrary to what the government said, that this was a matter for the courts, not just a matter of politics, that the executive had clearly abused its powers, and that Parliament's role as holding the executive to account, deliberating in public on matters of state, that all these matters have been infringed. So for Mr. Johnson, as Prime Minister, he has very hard questions to answer about whether his position as Prime Minister is tenable.
Which is quite something. I mean, he's waking up in New York currently. He's there on a visit
to the UN.
What does he do next? I mean, Parliament will presumably reopen tomorrow, and MPs will sit again. What happens after that?
Well, first of all, the court made clear that the Parliament had not actually been prorogued because it was unlawful. So they should, in fact, be sitting, but they left it to the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, to decide.
Huge victory for him, isn't it?
A big one, and for Gina Miller, by the way, who brought the suit in the first place from Joe Cherry. But and by the way, another very important point, that the Supreme Court ruled in exactly the same way, as strongly as the Supreme Court in Scotland, the Court of Session. So you have a sort of unanimity between England, Wales and Scotland. That's important for the United Kingdom. But what next? Well, I think Mr. Johnson's going to deliberate at the United Nations with his inner circle, and he's going to face a Parliament comeback. And he will have to answer questions about whether his position is sustainable. He's let it be known last night that he intended to stay on whatever the ruling.
He also said he was going to study the ruling carefully, but we are in untested waters, aren't we? I mean, for a British Prime Minister to have been called in court that his actions were unlawful is something this is new ground for us.
It definitely is, and you know, there is a history on Mr. Johnson's part of brazening things out, facing controversy, from plagiarism to other matters, shall we say. This, of course, is on a different scale. This involves matters, high matters of state, constitutional propriety, and just the way this thing was managed. I mean, remember, he and his circle prorogued, they decided to prorogue Parliament, asked the Queen's support, which they got, the royal assent for suspending Parliament. I mean, essentially, the ruling supports the fact that he misled the Queen. He said it was just he wanted a new Parliament to discuss his new legislative.
Do you think, given this ruling, I mean, the approach of his administration, of his advisors, Dominic Cummings, the key one, has been to ride fairly roughshod over convention. Do you think that this necessitates a change?
I think it's important to recognise that Mr. Johnson and his Svengali advisor, Dominic Cummings, said that in order to achieve Brexit, we must get it by October the 31st. Come what may.
No ifs or buts.
No ifs or buts, because there's been too much delay, 3 years already since the referendum. And that's why they wanted to put pressure both on Parliament and on the EU to get a deal. There didn't be much progress here, by the way, on that deal. But my final point is that it's really important to distinguish between constitutional propriety and the Brexit question. In effect, the judges were not saying whether it was right to respect or not the referendum result. They were saying that the executive, Mr. Johnson,
very nice, these
and abused his power regarding Parliament's role. And so that is quite different. There will be people in the country, some conservative newspapers, who will denounce the judges as enemies of the people. I think this is completely wrong. It's very damaging for our democracy. And they should respect the fact that this was a unanimous judgment by the top judges in the land on matters of constitutional propriety. It goes to the heart of how our democracy can and should work.
And finally, Lionel, this case was so electric because it was in a sort of grey area of our unwritten constitution. There was some calls outside the court that I heard just now for a more codified, formalised, written constitution. Do you think that is something that we're going to get anywhere near?
I think it's premature to be moving towards a written constitution. That's a very big move. I think what you've seen today is the court adumbrate, delineate the limits of power for the executive and the role of democracy, of parliament in our democracy. That should be enough. It should be enough to reflect on. Let us just say this, though, given other matters of the constitution. We know the strains within the United Kingdom. We also know about the fact that maybe the House of Lords isn't the most efficient. It's a powerful scrutiny. There are other questions, powerful scrutiny of legislation, etc. But there are some problems that we have. But I think that's for another day. What we should today celebrate is that the judges stood up very clearly and unanimously for the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson's speech. I know he had a speech yesterday. Boris Johnson's speech, New York. There we go, so I did miss something out.
May could tell Boris Johnson that this is the one time, no matter how powerless and troubled you are back home, you're going to come over here for the General Assembly, walk the world stage with other world leaders, walk the part, and Boris Johnson will be talking about other issues here, like Iran, where he seems to be trying to nose President Trump towards a new deal on Iran, and he'll be talking about climate change. But all the leaders here know that he's hamstrung, virtually powerless back home because of Brexit, and the critical meetings taking place here are the ones about that subject. He's about to meet, he may even be meeting right now, the European Council President Donald Tusk. He's going to meet President Macron and Chancellor Merkel together in the room. That could be a critical, decisive moment in working out whether what he's trying to put together as a deal has got any legs. He's going to be meeting the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, tomorrow. What we know about that deal and some of the gloomy noises coming around suggest that things may have gone a little bit backwards on that front. I talked to Boris Johnson a little earlier about all of that, but I started by asking him about the Act of Parliament that had been passed, which compels him to sign on the dotted line if there is no deal at the summit next month with the EU, and request a Brexit delay. That he would observe general laws. Would he, I asked him, observe this one?
What we're going to do is ensure that the UK comes out of the EU on October the 31st, with or without a deal. And I think it's very important for people to understand that we will not extend. Actually, I've made that point.
That's not compatible. This law requires you to sign a letter, as you well know, if you haven't got a deal, requesting a delay. You're not ready to do that. You will not sign that letter, is what you said.
What I'm saying is that we will obey the law, but we will also ensure that we come out of the EU on October the 31st. And
those two things are not necessarily compatible. Well, they put you into a corner with
people of this country. That's what the people of our country, so not this country, we're in America now. That's what the people of...
a lot of people would say it's no longer do or die, your old phrase. It's deal or die, because this kills you politically if you haven't got a deal.
What is certainly true is that the so-called surrender bill that you're holding, the Surrender Act, has confused our friends and partners, and its intention plainly was to undermine the UK's ability to negotiate, and its intention was plainly to take away the option of leaving without a deal. But what I'm telling you is that we're going to obey the law, but we're going to make sure that without extending, we come out of the EU.
I can't see your hand. Have you got your fingers crossed behind your back? You hoping that they will allow a delay? You're going to ask your European partners to forbid a delay.
I think what most
in Brexit.
people, we're working very hard to get a deal.
But are you going to ask them for that?
We're working very hard to get a deal. And as you rightly say, Gary, the intention of the Surrender Act was to make a deal more difficult by undermining.
I did say that.
By undermining our negotiating.
What if the Cabinet Secretary signed this? Would
that is clearly something that we have to take in
Jammy
stride,
Dodgers.
but get on with securing a deal.
Could someone else sign this letter that is required by this bill? Now,
I'm telling you, if you really got the policy of what we're going to do, what we want to do is get on and deliver on the mandate of the people and come out of the EU on October the 31st. And actually, I think that that would be a wonderful thing because, and will be a wonderful thing, because it will end the acrimony and the rancour and the fever that we're all currently prone to.
We'll see about that. But can I ask you about the backstop and what it is that you're seeking? You don't want the Theresa May backstop. You want a different type
Jammy Dodgers.
arrangement.
Raspberry.
But we don't want a backstop.
Jammy Dodgers.
And clearly, if there is one, that won't work for the UK. And we've been very clear with our friends about that.
You've turned around to Ireland and to the EU and said that you'd be willing to have all Ireland arrangements on agriculture, foodstuffs, animal safety, the rest of it.
Well, we've said that about sanitary and phytosanitary.
Do you
measures?
think that it's now
because that's not necessarily the same as agri-food?
No, you've put some other things, and you've qualified that in the document you sent to the EU, and they say that's not nearly enough. But do you now think it's time for Dublin to lean in a bit and try maybe and make some concessions in your direction, maybe on other goods, and maybe come into our sphere of regulation on other goods?
I think what is certainly a good thing is if everybody comes together to try to sort this out, Gary. It's been going on for far too long. People are very frustrated. They're very frustrated also with what's been going on in Parliament, the processes that you describe. They wanted to get Brexit done. They wanted it done. I'm going to work very hard to get a deal. Where I've just been having conversations with European EU colleagues right now, and there is a way forward.
Do you think it's time for Ireland to compromise a bit more than it has done?
I think there's an opportunity for us to get an agreement that really looks after the critical interests of everybody in the EU, including Ireland. So you protect the single market, the unity of the four freedoms of the single market. You protect the gains Ireland has had. You protect the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process. And above all, you ensure, and we will make a legal undertaking, you ensure that there are no checks at the border in Northern Ireland. Now, it's we, on our side, who are saying that we won't have checks. And I think what would be good would be to hear from the EU side that they won't have checks either. Because frankly, we don't think that is remotely necessary. We think there are other and better ways of doing this.
Tell me more about the sunlit up plans as you see it of Brexit.
Yes.
You're quite clear that the political declaration should head us in the direction of a Canada-style free trade agreement, not too close to the EU institutions and the rest of it.
Well,
that's right, isn't it?
When you say too close to, obviously we will continue to have conversations with everybody around the world.
Are we intending to diverge? This is the question they keep asking.
Okay, that's very important. And the clear answer to that, Gary, must be yes.
Okay,
we will,
so
if necessary.
environmental, consumer protections, worker protections,
on tariff structures, on
trade,
on customs, and where necessary, in future, where the EU adopts a regulation that may be prejudicial to the interests of some cutting-edge British technology, then yes,
in future
it may be that
we
will
not carry on to ones that we currently have obeyed as members. Might you want to pull away some of those?
And don't forget what
people talk about, the sort of Singapore dream. You know what I'm asking about, and we've lost sight of that a bit. Is that your destination?
I understand that, but don't forget, one of the things that we did was to take all the current corpus of EU law and put it into our statute book to make it absolutely clear that
you can always change that. Well,
yes,
you couldn't because you haven't got a majority, but
of course,
a prime minister with majority.
That's exactly right. So
is that the aim?
No,
to rip up some of that stuff.
Well, let me be clear on social protection, on workers' rights, on environmental standards. We want to keep the existing thresholds, but
So
it may be.
what's the point?
It may be. Well, for instance, it may
Where are
be
you
that
gonna divert?
we want to ban the live export of animals.
I don't remember that was what they were knocking on
Actually,
doors
it
about
was
in the
a lot of-
referendum.
Well,
Are they
it may
doing
be
a lot
a
of
lot
that?
of people. It may be that we want to ban the sale of shark fin soup, Gary, which you can't do. Maybe you want to ban the sale of shark fins.
This
which you
sounds
can't
like pretty
at the
small
moment.
fry.
Well, there
for
are plenty of
one of the biggest
there are
convulsions in British political
on the
history.
contrary, I think there are a lot of people in our country who do. You asked about environmental protections. There may be other ways, for instance, when it comes to financial services or biotechnology, where we want to do things differently.
We're waiting for
and there are big advantages. It may be that we want, for instance, to take advantage of tax freedoms to allow companies to invest more in capital and plant. We may want to do free ports in the UK to drive up economic growth in areas that have fallen behind, because we believe in levelling up across the UK. There are plenty of ways in which Brexit will allow us to take this incredible country, the UK, forwards. And we can only take advantage of those new freedoms if we come out of the EU on October the 31st and get on with it. That's what we're going to do.
Supreme Court judgment coming up. Will you prorogue Parliament again? Will you rule out proroguing Parliament again, whatever they say?
Let's be clear what happened. And everybody, I think, has slightly misconstrued what took place. They say that we were trying to stop Parliament from discussing Brexit or discussing.
Your answer to my question might help me know whether you were or not.
Let me answer you. I think it was a good idea to have. I'll see what the justices say.
You might do it again. So why would you be doing it again if not for any other reason than to stymie Parliament?
It was a good idea, and still is a good idea, a very good idea, to have a Queen's speech. This parliamentary session has been going on for longest since the Civil War. The opposition front bench were clamouring for a Queen's speech. We have lost, in terms of parliamentary sitting time, about 4 or 5 days, and MPs have the opportunity.
Those numbers.
MPs have the opportunity to come back and debate a Brexit deal. I hope I will.
Will you rule out doing it again? You're eating into their time. You're trying to reach into mine a bit. You're eating into their time by having a possible budget to have Queen's speech debates and the rest of it. There's a big debate over how much time they really have. Will you rule out proroguing another time?
Look, I think the best possible solution for our country is to get on and do a good deal, which I think.
So you might use prorogation to get there.
Those are your words. Those are your words, Gary. I want us to get on and do a good deal, and then there will be time between the summit on October 17th and 18th for us to consider in Parliament the deal that we have done. I hope that colleagues will want to vote for it and get this thing over the line.
Prime Minister, thank you.
Thank you.
Gary now joins us live. So, Gary, how important are the meetings that Boris Johnson is having out there for getting a Brexit deal?
He was trying to downplay that a bit, say don't expect a New York breakthrough, but I understand these are seen as pretty critical moments as to whether his plan really does have a chance. He batted away a question to an American reporter who called out to him a second ago how going, and he said solid. It really doesn't feel like that at the moment. Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was speaking in Berlin today, and he said what Boris Johnson's put on the table at the moment looks to him unacceptable. British sources say, well, Michel Barnier's got these 2 things he constructed, a Northern Ireland backstop, a UK-wide backstop, painstakingly put together. He doesn't want any of them fiddled with, and the real game is with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, and that game resumes in those talks in there. And I suspect one of the key things Boris Johnson is going to be saying to them, may already have said to European leaders, is don't make my job harder getting a deal through Parliament by allowing the possibility of a delay to the Brexit date. Stick hard to the 31st of October. Don't let that Act of Parliament, which I was talking about there with him, come into play. I suspect he'll be trying to get them to help him out with that. Whether they will or not, we may find out fairly soon.
Well, now, Gary, has he had any more to say on the allegations in the Sunday Times that he may have behaved improperly by doing favours for a friend whilst London Mayor?
That's right. This relates to the businesswoman Jennifer R. Curry. And yesterday, when a few of us reporters got together and asked the Prime Minister about this, he didn't seem to want to comment. 6 times he was asked and just sort of batted away and said, I'm here to talk about the UN. He's moved off that position today and said everything that was done as Mayor of London was done with complete propriety and in the normal way. So he's shifted the ground there. I suspect everybody is waiting to see if there are any more allegations that come out. I should tell you that Jennifer R. Curry herself put out a statement that appeared with the original Sunday Times allegations, saying that any grants she'd had or trade missions she'd been on were purely in respect of her role as a legitimate businesswoman.
John Bercow's speech.
Good evening. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you very much. As director of the Institute of Politics here at the Harvard Kennedy School, I am delighted to welcome you to the JFK Junior Forum address by the Right Honorable John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons. And this has been a very busy start to our forum season this semester. We've had an active schedule already with Congressman Will Hurd of Texas. We've had a fascinating conversation about athletics and activism with Clark Kellogg and former IOP fellow Brittany Packman. And we've had a very rich discussion with our IOP resident fellows on the 2020 election and issues pressing both domestically and internationally. This Thursday, we'll host a forum entitled Hong Kong, the Future of One Country, Two Systems, with our colleague Tony Sage from the Ash Center, Jane Perlos, who's a Shorenstein Fellow and the Beijing New York Times Bureau Chief, and Victoria Tinmore-Huey, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. And this forum really has been, since 1978, an important place for honest dialogue and debate, informal remarks. It's been important for students and faculty and staff and community members to engage with those who take the stage, from heads of state to leaders of legislative bodies to journalists, activists, and others from across the globe. And one of the great traditions of the forum is that every speaker has to submit to questions from the audience, from students and others. Our own question and answer period. And so around the room, you will see microphones. And at the conclusion of the talk, my colleague, Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, will moderate the question and answer period. Catherine, of course, is the executive director of the Project on Europe and Transatlantic Relationships. But tonight, we welcome the Right Honorable John Bercow. It's my pleasure to introduce him. He's been a speaker, common speaker since 2009. And I think it's fair to say this is a parliamentary speaker who has a worldwide audience. He is certainly the most visible and certainly the most viral speaker in a generation. As he manages the Prime Minister's question and answer period with shouts of you have some competition here. Welcome to Harvard. He is the first common speaker since World War II to have served along 4 prime ministers, and he himself has been elected to his leadership post 4 times. He is not reluctant to exercise his power from the chair by wielding power with authority during these uncertain times, and certainly with Brexit. He's championed the rights of the backbenchers, with granting more than 650 urgent questions from MPs, more than any other speaker, to bring, in his view, ministers to account for pressing issues of the day. So please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy School, to Harvard University, for his first appearance here in the forum, the Right Honorable John Bercow.
Mark, thank you. Bless you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Order! Order! Mark, thank you for the warmth and generosity of that welcome, to which I don't know, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, whether I'm entirely equal, but I shall strive to do my level best not to disappoint. Perhaps I can begin by saying that, having heard myself introduced, I can hardly wait to hear myself speak. Whether you'll feel the same way at the end of my remarks is a matter for legitimate speculation and conjecture, but it seems apposite to begin by asking, can you hear me at the back and on the top? Well, I want to thank you for that answer, which was of crystal clarity in the affirmative, and which marks, if I may say so, and I do, a notable improvement upon the last occasion that I posed that question outside of the United States. Can you hear me at the back? To an audience in which some unhelpful wag replied, yes, but I'll happily change places with someone who can't. So, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that you can hear me and that you appear not altogether distraught about that fact is the source of modest succor and encouragement to me as I begin. Mark, of course, has a track record of public service and of academic and professional leadership, which speaks for itself. I have, in fact, this evening on meeting him, hands, dubbed him the intellectual Gandalf of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. It is the most enormous pleasure, privilege, and honor to be invited to speak to this gathering, and I made my views on that matter very clear to Catherine as well. Now, you may say, oh, well, John's just paying obeisance to the protocol. He's just observing the niceties. He thinks it's the courteous thing to do to say thank you, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. And of course, to an extent, that is what you would expect a visiting speaker to do. But it goes deeper than that. I have long admired Harvard University as a whole, and the Kennedy School of Government and the Institute of Politics in particular. It seems to me that Harvard University is synonymous with the exploration and interplay of ideas on a scale unsurpassed by any academic institution anywhere in the world known to me. So for those of you who study here, you must be suffused with pride of how fortunate you are, what opportunities it presents, how you can gain both in the short as well as in the medium and long term from the experience of being taught here, self-studying here, interacting with others here, and benefiting from the truly global esteem in which this magnificent university is held. I am thrilled to be here beyond words. Before I say anything that treats of my responsibilities, I am, however, conscious of one quite sensitive matter, which your natural courtesy may disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk, potentially from my vantage point, perilously in the undergrowth, and which I conclude, therefore, should be knocked on the head at the outset. And that is the delicate and sensitive matter of height. Very specifically, it has been bruited in some of the more down market parts of the media that I'm the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you with all the force and rhetorical insistence at my command that there's nothing wrong with being short. I say to those who share that characteristic of vertical challenge with me, we short people should stick together. We may be short, but we may also be perfectly formed. We're assuredly environmentally friendly because we don't take up much space. And in any case, we have to make a virtue of necessity, and I do. I've always been short. I'm now 56 years old and I remain short, and given the known impact of the aging process upon physiognomy, the overwhelming likelihood is that I shall become inexorably and irrevocably shorter still. And about the fact of that continued and soon to be exacerbated shortness, I'm as intensely relaxed as Peter Mandelson, doyen of New Labour, Svengali of the Third Way, once said that New Labour was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. But I'm not intensely relaxed about the matter of historical accuracy. You'd expect the Speaker, forsooth, to have done his research, if in no other respect, I hope at least in that respect not to disappoint you, I have done. And it's quite wrong when some of these more down-market, low musical scribblers say, well, Bercow's the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Quite wrong. Sir John Bussey, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1394 to 1398. Sir John Wenlock, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1455 to 1456. And Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am. It was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's block. One was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So you will understand that this does enable me to view the woes and challenges which afflict and confront the House of Commons, and which in all candour periodically afflict and confront me with an appropriate sense of historical perspective. That is to say, whatever else happens to me, I am not likely to lose my head, though there may be some who wish to contradict that proposition because they have plans of which I know nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great joy to be here, and I want, if I may, to make 3 key points to you. First, and it relates to the best known and most visible function of the Speaker of the House. The primary duty of the Speaker of the House of Commons is to chair in the chamber, chair question times, Prime Ministers and other ministerial question times, chair the delivery of government statements and questioning thereon, chair key debates in Parliament. In that capacity, the first essential prerequisite is for the Speaker to have a decent memory. The Speaker is obliged to know who all 649 other members are, of which parties they're members, which constituencies they represent in the House, and on key issues, not on the vast miscellany of political topics, but on key issues where members stand. So if you take Brexit or Israel, Palestine, it's up to me to have a sense of their vantage point, not because I'm seeking to censor, but because I'm seeking to facilitate the fullest and fairest expression of opinion which exists in the House. The Speaker in our system, by contrast with that of others, including that of your own magnificent legislature, the key responsibility of the Speaker is to be an umpire or a referee rather than a player on the pitch. My job is to try to ensure that all the different voices are heard, the nuances of argument are explored, that I exercise my discretion to select new clauses to legislation and amendments both to legislation and to motions in order to tease out the key issues and allow, if you will, the democratic appetite of the House of Commons to be satisfied. your own magnificent speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has a different role. And of course, one readily understands that the role is much more party political in the United States. I seek to discharge my responsibilities by ensuring that I know who everybody is, that I'm focused on the subject matter at hand, that I'm aware of the range of issues potentially to be explored in debate and by separate division or vote, and that everybody gets a fair opportunity. Can I please everybody? Oh, come, 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 illustrious and cerebral glitterati of Harvard University. What are those pigs I see flying in front of my very eyes? It is completely impossible to satisfy everybody. There will always be a colleague who is completely convinced that there is no debate that would not be improved by a contribution from him or her of quite stunning erudition and probably of comparable length. And you cannot understand why the opportunity to speak that day has not been afforded by the chair. The reality, of course, is that there is the ever-present, the unfailing, the never-disappearing
it's the way it is at times,
of time. And you can simply do your best. And I think if you satisfy most people most of the time, that is as much as realistically hope to accomplish. So that is the first and foremost, the without which nothing function of the Speaker of the House of Commons. To be the referee, to be the umpire, and knowing who everybody is and showing reasonable physical stamina. My longest stint in the chair in my tenure has been 14 hours without a break, and decent levels of concentration out of respect for individual members and for the House as an institution. However, the second point I want to make to you is that although at various times in our parliamentary and political history, that has been all that was requested of the Speaker of the House, it has been context dependent. And when I stood for election, as Mark rightly observed, in the summer of 2009, there was an atmosphere of expectation of, and almost I would say clamour for, change within the institution of the House of Commons. To wit, people felt that Parliament had to change. And my own proposition to my colleagues in seeking election against 9 other candidates at that time was that over a period of decades, under governments of both complexions, of right and left, including periods of pacts with other parties, there had been one recurrent theme, one constant. And that recurrent theme or constant was that the power of government had increased and was continuing to increase, and in my judgment, it needed to be either reduced or checked. Of which, my friends, the corollary that I also put to colleagues was that the power of Parliament over that period of probably 4 decades had decreased, was continuing to decrease, and needed to be increased. So I said, look, if you elect me, I will try for a start to speed up question time and to ensure that we get through more, because progress is rather lethargic. And what has happened is that people who serve as members of Parliament have given up on the chamber. They despair of getting called to ask a question if they're at number 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 on the order paper, the list of potential questions for the day. Instead, they go off and they write a blog, or they do a radio interview, or they turn up in a television studio. And the life is being sapped from the chamber of the House of Commons, the principal part and the elected part, the democratic part of the legislature of the United Kingdom. That's got to change. So I've tried to speed up question time, and simply as a matter of fact, we do get through a lot more questions now than we used to do. But very specifically, I identified a series of changes which, with the support and collaboration of the House, I would want to see take root in our proceedings and affairs. And in the time available, I'd like to highlight one to which Mark, in his generous introduction, alluded. I said, colleagues, I think too often there's a mismatch between what we're debating and what the public are thinking, what we're arguing about and what preoccupies them, what we're voting on and what they think we should be debating or voting upon in the House of Commons. What we need to do is to revive urgency and topicality. And so I said, look, if you elect me as Speaker, I want to revive the mechanism or the instrument of the urgent question, capital U, capital Q, for which there has been long-standing provision in our standing orders, but which has fallen into disrepute in recent years. In the year before I was elected Speaker, 2 urgent questions were granted by the Speaker, because they are applied for to the Speaker, and granted or not granted by the Speaker. In my first year, we had 24. We have had 658 over the last decade. And the reason why I wanted to make that change was that I thought it will bring colleagues back into the chamber. It will be an enabling, a revitalizing, for members who want to question, to probe, to scrutinize, to challenge, perhaps to contradict, or to expose the errors of omission or commission of the government of the day. So it will be a real opportunity for the legislature, and correspondingly, it will hold ministerial feet to the fire, requiring ministers, whatever else they're doing, to come to the chamber for a specified period, at least 20 minutes, but possibly 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, an hour of sustained questioning. And that's what I have sought to do and have done with the support of colleagues. And of course, the climate of expectation has been such that far more people apply for urgent questions now because they know there's a decent chance of getting them. There have been other changes with the support of the House, which I, but many others, championed, to elect the chairs of the committees that scrutinise the executive branch, as opposed to the previous extraordinary arrangement whereby the people who chaired the committees that scrutinised the executive were handpicked by representatives of that executive. Well, that's gone. We have elected select committee chairs and by party caucus elected members of select committees. We have a backbench business committee that chooses the business one day a week. Typically 30 business would not necessarily and ordinarily would not have been chosen by the government or even necessarily the official opposition. But it's what ordinary elected legislators and representatives of principles and of causes and of constituencies want to be on the agenda. So it's happened. We have elected deputy speakers. All of my 3 deputies are elected by secret ballot rather than by the vote. The whips on the whole on both sides were not wild keen on this democratic renaissance that has taken place at the behest of my colleagues with support from me. Why? Well, people who've got power, of course, want to keep it. When I was a backbencher and indeed an opposition spokesperson, I confess that I had a relationship with the whips characterised by trust and understanding. But far more members are backbenchers than front, not part of the ruling machine, but entitled, nay, obliged constitutionally to stand up for what they believe is right, so to question, to explore, to seek agreement. That is the function of a legislature. And I think that the other changes I've mentioned are very worthwhile and extremely important, and there's more to be done. I think we could reform the House further. I think we could deal with private members' legislation better. I think that we could have a trigger mechanism for the recall of Parliament, which would not depend upon the government of the day, something for which I've argued for a long time, but which has not happened. I would like government business, which they've a right to stage and to get through if they've got the votes, to be timetabled by a House, capital H, business, capital B, committee, capital C, rather than just determined behind closed doors by the government's representatives in consultation with, but in a very superior position to, representatives of the opposition. So there are lots of other reforms that could take place, but those reforms have been worthwhile. And I think that the urgent question reform has been probably the single biggest instrument of parliamentary scrutiny and empowerment over the last decade. Outside the chamber, I regarded it as a priority to try to modernize the parliamentary estate. The Speaker chairs the House of Commons Commission, which is the strategic governing body of the House. When I was elected, I thought it completely ridiculous that we got a shooting gallery on the parliamentary estate. But to broker a better way, we have a thriving, highly successful, extremely well-subscribed nursery on the parliamentary estate, and the shooting gallery is being closed down due to lack of demand. That is surely a very much more satisfactory distribution of priorities. I wanted to build, not least having admired what's happened in Washington, an education centre analogous to a visitor centre in Parliament that would enable us to showcase what we've done over the centuries in Westminster and to draw in another 100,000 young people a year to come to Westminster to learn about the journey to the rights and representation that we enjoy today by comparison with where we started several hundred years ago. Well, we can't be accused of hurrying matters in Parliament. The digital, high-tech, cutting-edge, interactive, state-of-the-art facility called the Education Centre, which is adjacent to the House of Lords, was a project with the support of colleagues that I wanted to drive forward. And that facility was opened in 2015, in the year that we marked the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta and the 750th anniversary of the first recognisably English Parliament. So we cannot be accused of excessive haste. Treebeard from Lord of the Rings against excessive haste would doubtless applaud the fact that we took so long, but I think we took far too long to build that facility, but thankfully we did. And another priority for me has been to try to promote diversity and inclusion on the parliamentary estate. We are home to debating chambers in Commons and Lords. We're also a World Heritage Site. We are a supplier of services. And, ladies and gentlemen, we are a significant employer, and we owe a duty of care to those whom we employ and those who are not employed by but are contracted to work for Parliament and serve on the parliamentary estate. And for me, it's been a big mission to try to make the staff complement of the House look somewhat more like the country we're charged to represent. So I do take pride in the fact that I appointed the first female and BAME Speaker's Chaplain, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, in the history of the House of Commons, the warmest, most engaging and empathetic, inspiring Speaker's Chaplain anyone could want, who is about to become Bishop of Dover after a fantastic tenure in the service of the House. I appointed the first BAME Sergeant at Arms, Mohammed Kamal Al-Haji, in the history of the House. I did appoint the first female and BAME Speaker's Counsel, senior lawyer in the House, in our history. There's a lot more to do. We need to learn. Advice must be sought, expert consultancy guidance on how best to recruit, to retain, to talent nurture and promote people across the piece. But we do need to make sure that we redouble our efforts and don't stand still. The last point I want to make to you is that I believe that alongside that first role of chairing in the chamber and that second role of acting as a facilitator of or a catalyst for necessary, desired and overdue change, there is the note as ambassador for Parliament, an advocate of democratic politics more widely across the country and beyond. I have to be impartial within the chamber, but I don't have to be impartial about the chamber. And surely we have got to be intelligible to, and if possible, appreciated by the electorate that we serve. And that's why I said, well, if you elect me as Speaker, I intend to get out and about beyond the Palace of Westminster to visit schools and colleges and universities and faith groups and charitable institutions and public bodies to talk about the functions of the Speaker and the role of Parliament and the nature of our democracy, how it's changing, why it matters, in what way people can engage with us. And it is also why I resolved on day one that I would every year chair the UK Youth Parliament's annual sitting on the green leather benches on a non-sitting Friday in Westminster, which I've done since 2009. And I said to the UKYP, I'll come to your conference every year, not as a picket, not as an unwelcome blot on the horizon, but as a visitor to talk to and hear from you if you want. Now, why have I done that with the UK Youth Parliament? Well, the cynics amongst you would say, well, because, as my late father used to say, John, generally speaking, is generally speaking. And you'd be right, that's true. I enjoy it. I love communication. And I enjoy chairing those debates and going to their conference. But for another reason, which I hope you will accept, and that is that I think that if we, in Parliament, want ever again to be respected by young people, we have to show respect for young people. Respect is not our automatic right, it is an earned credit, or if you will, a two-way street. And what better way to show one's support for and belief in the institution of the Youth Parliament than to devote the time and energy to attend to them and offer support for them. I hope I've given you a flavour of what I do. I haven't touched significantly on Brexit. It is not for me to implement Brexit or to stop Brexit. There are a number of possible outcomes of Brexit about which I think your insatiable appetite will be such that somebody will wish to probe me. But I have given you a sense of what it is I do, chairing in the chamber, trying to deliver a better, more modernised, reformed institution, and getting out and about, not incarcerated in the Palace of Westminster, dressed up in a fancy uniform and completely inaccessible to the outside world. People who hold important public offices, I'm not important at all, other than I hope to my wife and children, but the office of Speaker is important. And I think people who occupy important public offices have got to get out there and make the case, talk to, hear from, and engage with people. There can be literally, in university terms, no greater honour anywhere in the world than to be invited to appear before the JFK Junior Forum. I am thrilled. You can probably tell it, and you will now be relieved beyond words in view of your stoicism, fortitude, and forbearance to know that my speech is definitively at an end. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I am Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook. I am the Executive Director of not only the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship, but also the Future of Diplomacy Project right here at the Belfer Center. And really, nobody could have said it any better that what is said about this Speaker of the House of Commons is right. He is, in his role as protector of the realm, he is the majoritarian dictator, I think. The protector, the backbencher's backstop, the protector of the realm. So it is my role in 2 quick questions to filibuster, but I have very little time to have to do that because, as you can already see, people have lined up. We have 4 microphones. Please use them to your best advantage because we will use them to your best advantage. This is the JFK Junior Forum. And with that come certain ground rules. The ground rules are as follows. Introduce yourself. Tell us why you're here. Keep your question to a question. No long speeches, please. Let your voice rise at the end so that we know that there's a question mark, and then we will turn it over to you. So I really have only 1 question as we get this started, because you said that nothing at this point is off limits. And the thing that is burning under our fingernails is, of course, what will happen between now and October 31st. And as all of you students of the UK democracy will know, Parliament has the sovereignty, the ultimate sovereignty. And you have just heard why it is critical to protect it. But tomorrow, and that is an important moment, I think, in this constitutional crisis, the courts, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, will be coming together in an emergency session. In some regards, perhaps to take over that protective realm, because they will be deciding on whether or not the prorogation of Parliament, this 5-week break that you are now have been subjected to, is lawful or is in fact unlawful. So my question to you then is, in this interplay between critical institutions, the courts now coming to help democracy, how do you see this playing out? Is this an advantage? Does this help and strengthen faith in British democracy at this critical time where Brexit is upon us? Or is this in fact a show of weakness for British democracy?
I don't think it can ever be a weakness, Karen. Thank you very much indeed. When there is, if you will, a backstop, a final arbiter, a decision-making mechanism. I think it would be a weakness if there were paralysis and no way of deciding, but that's not the situation. We have a prorogation of Parliament. You will be familiar with that fact. There have been many, many, many prorogations. There is a considerable body of opinion that feels that this prorogation is different. I've expressed my views on that matter. It will be determined by the Supreme Court in the coming days. I think anybody who predicts, either with certainty or with complete confidence, what the outcome will be is either extraordinarily clever or a reckless fool. So I'm not going to predict what the outcome will be because I simply don't know. What I do say is that there are three possible scenarios between now and the end of October. Either there is an approved Brexit deal, and we leave because Parliament has approved said deal. Alternatively, there is not an approved deal because a deal that is put is rejected, but Parliament resolves that we shall nevertheless leave at the end of October. That's the second scenario, which is democratically legitimate. The third scenario is that Parliament decides that it wants further time, an extension of Article 50, as a route and in order to segue to a mechanism for making a decision. That mechanism may be another election, or it could be another public vote in the form of a plebiscite. I'm not arguing for one or other of those three. I'm simply saying that those are the scenarios. What seems to me as Speaker, as a representative of Parliament, of critical importance is that what happens by way of decision must be the result of the explicit endorsement of the UK Parliament. We cannot elide into something by happenstance, by accident, by omission, by default. Parliament must come to a view, and any view to be legitimate has, in my judgment, to be authorised by Parliament, period.
Your word in God's ear, not the advice that Ian Duncan Smith gave the Prime Minister, as all of you will know, but we will certainly probe those questions a little bit more. You get the first question.
Thank you. My name is Todd Gillespie. I'm a student in the SAS. Much of the coverage of you in the US, as well as speech and introduction this evening, has conveniently ignored the context of widespread bullying in the British Parliament, including allegations against yourself. I was wondering if you, apparently, according to the moderator, had anything to say to the staffers who have endured a culture which Dame Laura Cox's report called a culture of subservience, acquiescence and silence, in which bullying, harassment and sexual harassment have long been tolerated and concealed, or indeed to Kate Ems, your former staffer, who was diagnosed with PTSD after 9 months of working for you?
No, I'm very happy to respond to that question. First of all, I have explicitly and publicly on several previous occasions made absolutely clear my utter rejection of any idea that we can tolerate bullying. Where we have failed, we've got to put matters right. I accepted on the floor of the House of Commons the recommendations of Dame Laura Cox. Parliament is implementing the recommendations of Dame Laura Cox, and it is doing so with my full and enthusiastic support. That is not a matter of opinion, but of record. You won't expect me, ladies and gentlemen, matters appertaining to particular individuals in a public forum, which would be completely unethical and improper. I have no intention of doing so. What I do say is that I totally, utterly refute any allegation against me of bullying. I have never bullied anyone, anywhere, in any way, at any time. What I have done is stand up for the rights of the House of Commons, champion the legislature, ensure the intimidation of those who want to speak their mind does not hold sway. And as far as staff is concerned, what I will say to you, sir, a legitimate question, is this. I wouldn't have, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, people who've worked in my office for the full decade of my tenure with total loyalty and commitment if I somehow maltreated my staff. I've never done so, I don't do so, and until my dying day, I will proclaim my commitment to and my record in the fair treatment of everybody who works with me or for me. That's my position. It's always been my position. It will remain my position. People can say what they like, but innocent until proven guilty. And I repeat, sir, for your benefit, I've never bullied anyone, anywhere, in any way, at any time. That has the advantage of being true. Thank you.
Right.
Hi, I'm David Franklin. I'm a second-year MPA ID student here at Harvard. You spoke about your duty to be impartial in the House, but not about the House. When the business is about the House, that would suggest that you could be faced with a paradox. Do you agree that there's a paradox there, and if so, how do you go about resolving it?
That is a very fair point. There can be a tension. That's a typically Harvard sophisticated question, and one lays oneself open to that if one comes to Harvard University to speak. You have to use your judgment as to what is the best interest of the House. If I may say so, I think that the overriding expectation and indeed insistence on the part of the House over decades has been that the House doesn't take sides in any party political sense. Manifestly, if there is an issue about is this the right way to treat the House or is that the right way to treat the House, and the Speaker is in some way either expected or almost required to take a view, well, taking a view means taking a view. It doesn't mean resolving not to take a view. As Churchill said, resolved to be irresolute, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. Well, that's not much use in those circumstances, is it? You have to be prepared to take a position. So I have done, but that isn't the same as taking a party political view. It's a little bit like inviting visitors to the House, where the Speaker has a role. I won't dwell on that, but where the Speaker has got a role in such matters, should an invitation be issued or shouldn't it, you obviously cannot be impartial as between issuing an invitation and not issuing an invitation. If the House of Commons were not to want the Speaker to have a role in such matters, it would be perfectly legitimate for the House to say, well, we'd like this process to be dealt with in some other way. But if it is expected of and incumbent upon the Speaker to make the judgments, well, then the Speaker shouldn't duck the judgments. And I haven't away from the judgments. I've tried to make the right judgments, but I've made the judgments that I've made, not in furtherance of a party cause, but in furtherance or protection of the parliamentary cause.
We'll go up here, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Chiron Jr. I'm a student from Bentley University. So permit me, first of all, congratulate your government, and particularly the House of Commons, which you had a speaker of for the great contribution in working with the government of Cameroon to come to a conclusion for a peace discussion. May I know what diplomatic measures your government is taking by itself and in collaboration with your international allies such as France, Canada, and the United States to ensure that the concept and processes of the projected dialogue are genuine and assurance of sustainable outcome through addressing the root cause of the problem?
Sir, that is an extraordinarily good, focused and lucidly delivered question, and I am pained to say this to you. But you know, politicians are always accused of ducking a question or of pretending to know an answer when they don't. So I'm afraid I'm going to give you an answer that you won't like, but it is not meant in any respect discourteously. I haven't the foggiest idea on that matter at this moment, And although it is a very important matter, it doesn't, I'm afraid, relate to the responsibilities of the Speaker. It's a very important question and it warrants further exploration. But could I answer you, or should I answer you now on that point? The answer, I'm afraid, is no and no.
Politicians that are fundamentally honest, a rarity in these days. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Siddharth Srikanth. I'm a first-year MPP at the Kennedy School. So, Mr. Bercow, you said, I think 3 days ago, that Britain needs a written constitution, presumably because the current one is being tested to its limits by Brexit, but by other factors as well. But you've also said in days that you are willing to use procedural creativity to try and stop a no-deal Brexit. And equally, Boris Johnson's government and Theresa May's before him stressed the limits of Commons procedures and, frankly, the law to try and get their version of Brexit through. So, do you risk, or have you already started an arms race between the Speaker and the government of the day, which risks spinning out of control and making the problem you described even worse? Or is there something fundamentally different about what the government's done that merits your response?
Thank you. First of all, I stretch the limits of the law, so it's an extremely good and probing question. In any way, I've operated within the law and, in my judgment, within the existing procedures of the House of Commons. I don't want to cavil, but I floated the idea that it was time to consider the merits of a written constitution. I didn't say we must have such, but I certainly think that it would be timely, properly to explore those issues. Either a Royal Commission or a Speaker's Conference that will be chaired by my successor. It's not a power grab on my part. I've already announced that I'm intending to depart by the end of October. But it does seem to me that those issues lend themselves to very thorough, concentrated and expert study and reflection. In terms of the approach to the period ahead, I haven't said that I will use creativity to try to stop a no-deal Brexit. I understand that this is sometimes a shorthand that people use, but forgive me being pedantic, ladies and gentlemen, but I must make, I'm not trying to promote one outcome or another. What I'm seeking to ensure is that the outcome that is arrived at in the period ahead is the conscious choice, the explicit preference of Parliament, whatever it may be. And when you say, might I risk, in a sense, exacerbating a tension, I hope not. I think it is a fair point to say this. There are procedures that have not been very ambitiously used in the past, which are now ambitiously used in the present. The Standing Order 24 procedure to provide for emergency debates, and on 2 occasions in the last 6 months, the effective claim by a majority vote of the House of parliamentary time to allow someone other than the government to introduce and pilot through successfully legislation. I believe that hasn't involved any trickery or any abuse or any breaking or manipulation of rules. It has allowed their full use. That's the observation that I would make. And the related point I make is this. The government, of course, has a right to govern and to try to secure support for its legislation and its policies. However, it's no indictment of any individual. It's not a commentary on the Prime Minister or his predecessor or the Leader of the Opposition. This is a minority government. And if others in Parliament, aside from the representatives of the executive branch, want to put propositions to the House in pursuit of a majority, it is reasonable for the Speaker to take into account whether there is a body of opinion that wants something different in conflict with what the government wants. Now, in allowing those propositions by others to be put, I'm not siding against the government. What I'm doing is saying, let the will of the House be tested in an orderly and democratic way. That's what I've done. I accept that it may be disquieting to some people, but it has been done honestly. I think it's fair-minded, and in a number of cases when I've allowed that to happen, that challenger viewpoint in democratic terms has then, I've allowed something to happen, taking up a great deal of time for which there's no great support. I have allowed things to happen for which there is great, and in many cases, majority support.
Just an additional question there, because I liked the allusion to the question of speed, because it's against the clock right now. I'm sure Parliament, again, not to decide in either way, but we are in a race against the clock. So as we imagine this going on in the chambers, because arms race was mentioned, pilfering through the history of is this how we imagine people poring over how we might use the law to create that continued birth for Parliament? Do you feel that that is going on because we are in this moment of extreme need for speed, frankly?
I do think speed is a huge factor. I think it's a combination, ladies and gentlemen, of the pressure of the clock on the one hand and the enormity of the subject matter on the other. And that combination is what is propelling colleagues, to be fair, on both sides of the argument, to ask themselves, well, what procedurally is possible and might we wisely do? And in each case, it is for the chair, where the chair has an arbitrating or decision-making role, to come to a view as to whether what is requested or proposed is orderly or not. And I can't necessarily please everybody, but I'm trying to do the right thing and then leave the House to make the judgment that it will. But yes, time and the subject matter are really the motive forces in this.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm a student at MIT. This is a follow-up to the notion of written versus unwritten constitution raised. Is the Fixed Term Parliaments Act really to blame for the current Parliament's, being stuck in a gridlock, as it were? Why or why not?
The Fixed Term Parliament Act was introduced as part of the agreement between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats after the 2010 elections. Prime Minister Cameron formed a coalition, not just a confidence and supply agreement, but a coalition with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. And one part of their joint endeavours was to pass that act so that the Prime Minister would no longer be the exclusive arbiter of when an election should be called. There would be a fixed term. Is it to blame for the situation that we're in? I think that does place far too great a weight on one piece in the jigsaw, if I can put it that way. There is no doubt, sir, that there are very different views about the act, if it was ever justified, remains so, and there are quite a lot of people who think that it shouldn't remain, but there are people who think that it should. It is a factor, and it makes a difference to calculation, obviously, if a government cannot simply call an election when it wants. But if you're asking me, do I think overall, it is a major contributory factor to where we are in the Brexit debate, I would say no. We've had 3¼ years of debate since the referendum, and there are all sorts of factors involved. The 2017 loss of the Conservatives' majority was a factor. The government, under Theresa May and then under Boris Johnson, has taken a particular view as to what its negotiating posture should be. There have been differences of opinion about the customs union and the single market and the miscellany of other issues. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act is part of the constellation of issues, but I wouldn't say myself, when we come to look at the issue as a whole, that it's completely centre stage. No.
All right, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Connor. I am a first year at the college. And I found it interesting how you spoke about the difference in models of speakership between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I'm curious, which model do you see as more productive for democratic discourse? That is, in your opinion, could the United States use a less partisan, more impartial institution of speakership in these divisive times? Or alternatively, could the United Kingdom use a more political speaker to deal with the present challenges?
Peaceful coexistence between different forms is what I commend to you, sir. Let me say to you that it would be the height of discourtesy, extraordinary presumption, and almost rank would-be constitutional imperialism for some visiting Brit to deign to toddle along to the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School in front of such cerebral company and to say what the Americans should do in the running of their affairs. There are parts of the United States, I very greatly regret this, I must say, as a long-term abolitionist, that there are parts of the United States where the death penalty still applies. I would be taking very grave risks if I thought it was right to lecture you on what you should do in your polity, in your circumstances, and with your mores. And by the way, I happen to think that Speaker Pelosi is the most outstanding public servant. That is my honest view. She's been a good personal friend to me, and she's somebody I enormously admire. But no, I think we should do things our way in the UK, and you can do them your way in America. I'm often accused of pontificating about what we ought to do in the UK, but it really would be a case of rhetorical overreach to start issuing sermons to the House of Representatives, and I will not do so.
And yet your deductive qualities are full on and on point. So you heard the subtext that was made right there. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Speaker.
Please.
My name is Eli Harrison. I'm from Brandeis University. I'm a politics major there. Arguably, the biggest issue with Brexit, as some believe, with the election of President Donald Trump, is not what has happened, but what hasn't happened during these periods, during this 3-year period. And so I'm wondering to you, in the what issue has suffered the most, be it domestic or international, in the vacuum of oxygen that Brexit has just consumed? What issue do you feel like you would really like to have seen debated much more so than it has been on the floor of the House of Commons?
Gosh, where do we start? It's 6:59. We are under the pressure of the clock. I would find it difficult to pick one issue. I'm sorry to duck it, but I mean, I think there are huge numbers of very important issues. I think there is the continued legislative drive against domestic violence, which is a big political issue, and I know that there are colleagues who want the government's intended legislation on that matter to be brought forward, and I'm sure the government would want to introduce it as soon as possible. I think that the challenge of climate change is an existential threat to all of our futures and could legitimately absorb more parliamentary time. I happen to think that the biggest moral imperative of our age is the necessary effort to try to alleviate the plight of the poorest people on the face of the planet, 1,000 million of whom don't live, they exist on less than $1 a day. Those are just some of the examples of issues for which we could have more time, were it not for the fact, and it is no one person or party's fault, I'm not blaming government or opposition, it's just a fact, that Brexit has dominated, to the detriment and sometimes almost to the complete exclusion of any other subject matter. But we have got to deal with the here and now, and even once we've dealt with the immediate legislative and political challenge of whether to conclude a withdrawal agreement, this issue will be with us in one form or another for a long time to come. The idea that it's a question of just sorting Brexit and then moving on is not the case. There will be a very, very long, substantial and detailed debate, absolutely properly, about the nature and configuration of our future relationships with our European partners and beyond, with trade issues and security issues, and a vast miscellany of other issues to discuss. But we've got to try to ensure that there is bandwidth so that a representative democracy can treat of the full range of issues that naturally absorb the interest and attention and speak to the needs and ambitions of our people. So there is a hell of a lot to do. I'm sorry I can't pick one issue, but I have given you some examples of issues for which more time is needed.
You get the last question in this round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just building upon the transatlantic question asked down there. So in a country like America, Donald Trump, who has no executive experience, can run to be president and be elected president, while in the UK, Boris Johnson, riding on a populist wave, isn't able to deliver a no-deal Brexit, arguably. One of our professors here at Harvard, the British government, has analysed that British democracy is in certain ways less directly democratic than other Western systems. It puts less power in the hands of voters and party grassroots, and more in the hands of party officials and institutional gatekeepers. Basically, the point being that the parties are stronger in the UK than they are in the USA. My question is, do you think that is a good system? Should we be aiming for a more open system? And what role do you think referenda can play in that in the future? Thank you.
And if I can just add to that, to have you weigh in on what may happen in October if we get the project Reset the Clock. So if the Prime Minister is serious about wanting to die in a ditch before he asks for an extension, then people are playing through all sorts of innovations that happen within the party system, including a national unity government, which would seem, for a bicameral system, quite the innovation at the heart of Parliament. So just as an addendum to that point.
I think parties are relatively strong in the UK, although I don't think you should overstate it, because I just want to throw back at you a counter proposition which isn't intended to rebut yours, but should be regarded as sitting at least alongside it, and it is this. People often talk about the career politician who just does what the party says, climbs the greasy pole, is persistently obedient in pursuit of career advantage or from loyalty. Well, actually, the incidence of intra-party rebellion, ladies and gentlemen, is much greater now than it was, for example, in the 1950s or 60s. And there was no golden age of Parliament. Sometimes it is suggested that there was a period in which sturdy men, and it was almost exclusively, indeed exclusively men, who came to Westminster to deliberate on the great issues of the day without fear or favour, simply on the basis of conscience and their dispassionate judgment of the public interest, and that today's lot are much inferior. That, frankly, has no historical evidence or reinforcement or basis whatsoever. The truth is, in centuries past, very large numbers of members of Parliament didn't come to Parliament at all, or they would come a small number of times a year. They would be tending to their estates or practicing at the bar or in their city banks or whatever. Members are very, very, very devoted to the service of their constituents, their causes, and their country, and they really do apply themselves. But a lot more members vote against the party whip now than was the case in the past, and that often rather upsets the whips, but it does at least show that people are attending to the issues and making a wider judgment about where they think the public interest lies. More widely, I would say, I think there's a really good time to look at the House's procedures, how we can strengthen the role of backbenchers, how we can give greater opportunities for the legislature to assert itself. There may be a good argument where there is ambiguity or unspecificity in our rules for greater clarity and increased specificity, so that there is almost a universal agreement as to what a particular rule or standing order or convention does permit or can require or indeed excludes. As far as referenda are concerned, I think that the likelihood is that the referendum will always be a part of a democracy's potential mechanisms for dispute resolution. I don't think that that will go away, and who knows whether there will or won't be another referendum in months or years to come. I don't know. But you won't be surprised to hear me say that We've had a referendum. We will have to reach a view about how we proceed in the light of it. But as a general principle, I am a passionate champion of representative democracy as a means by which to arrive at key decisions. The idea that more widely we should adopt a policy of plebiscitary democracy and have referenda on nuclear power and pensions policy and the approach to cutting the deficit or whatever is for the birds. People elect politicians to Parliament to make decisions, not to swerve around them. And so, that is, it seems to be the primary component part of our system. Representative democracy, people are representatives, not delegates. And as I said in the House the other day, I genuinely believe that the vast majority of my colleagues are motivated by their notion of the national interest, by their perception of the public good, and by their duty, not as delegates, but as representatives, to do what they believe is right for our country. That matters. It is precious, and we should not only preserve it, we should nurture it, we should cherish it, we should champion it.
That is, if I dare say, the perfect word on which to end Speaker John Bercow's defense, vivid defense, and I think in front of this audience, particularly the undergraduates that are with us today, whom the IOP educates to be dedicated to public service, to run for office, to commit themselves to the importance of a life of a public servant. You have just heard from a consummate public servant, arguably, and I will stand by my first word, the protector of the UK Parliament, the protector of that innate sovereignty that, Constitution or not, rests right at the heart of Westminster. Please join me in thanking Sean Bercow.
Thank you. Thank you. I so enjoyed it. I hope people did, but it was, for me, it was a great privilege and huge.
This audience doesn't have.
Right. Okay, guys, I've done like 1 hour on this video on my phone. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and please like, comment, and subscribe, and share these videos with your friends. You'll see Boris Johnson in New York speech on here, and John Bercow, the Speaker of Parliament UK, speech on here. Thank you for joining me. See you in the next stream, and take it easy, guys. Peace. See you later.